So thank you so much for inviting me to talk on this panel today. It's about a subject which I'm very enthusiastic about, which is doing a PhD and doing research in library and information science. And my job today my unofficial job is to tell you how wonderful that is, but I'll also be telling you some of the real life things and some of the negative, not negative sides, but some of the things you might want to consider as well. So it won't just all be kind of roses and running through the fields kind of happiness. There might be a lot of that, but there'll be some realistic stuff as well. So as Carla said, I've been given the task of introducing the whole concept of doing an LIS PhD. So I'll be talking a bit longer than everyone else. It is deliberate for once. It is actually deliberate rather than me just getting too enthusiastic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by introducing the idea generally of doing a PhD in library and information science, talk through some of the things that people might consider, kind of what it is and everything. Then I'm going to talk about a topic which I get asked about a lot, both by friends and by colleagues who are starting PhDs, and that is the topic of doing it part-time, okay, which I was hoping would be quite interesting to a professional audience who might be thinking about doing this, but particularly thinking about doing it part-time. And then in the third slide, I will tell you a little bit about my own background in art librarianship and my own PhD and what that was like and things like that. Okay, so doing a PhD in library and information science, well, obviously everyone knows this, but a PhD in the arts and humanities or social sciences is going to consist of writing a thesis. Oh gosh, typo on the first slide. Typically a thesis of between 80 and 100,000 words. So it's a long piece of written work. Normally in LIS, you won't be designing a program or something, so it's really going to be focused on those words rather than a piece of creative practice or writing a computer program or something like that. And 80 to 100,000 words, depending on what university you're at. And typically a full-time student would take 3 to 4 years to do this, and a part-time student would take 5 to 7 years, although it can take a lot longer. And that's what you're doing. You have a requirement to produce an original piece of work. It doesn't have to change the world, it doesn't have to change practice, but it does have to be original, which is actually very easy to do in a way, because once you get into your research, you'll be coming up with new ideas, and that's actually not quite as daunting as it might sound. So the idea is you make a significant contribution or some contribution to the field of library and information science or library and information studies by the time you finish your thesis. You hand in your thesis, you have a viva, people will ask you about it, you probably have some corrections, and then hopefully you get your PhD, and that's how it works. And I know many of you are supporting PhD students or have done a PhD, so you'll know this already. And so far, there's nothing different about this than, say, something like art history or art or music or history or something like that. Where can you do this? Well, this is where it is a little bit different from some other subjects, because we think of like art history as being quite a small subject, but LIS, sadly, is not taught in many universities. There are a number of places you can do this. UCL, obviously where I work, put that first, obviously. Sheffield, of course, is very, very famous. Strathclyde, Edinburgh Napier, Manchester Metropolitan City University. There might be a few others which I've missed, which I didn't realise have PhD programmes. I apologise in advance, no offence intended. I should just say at this point that I'm talking very much about doing a PhD in LIS in the UK. Because my subfield is actually very closely and has a very, very strong following in the US. I know quite a little bit about doing a PhD in LIS in the States, and it is quite different, and in Canada as well. So this talk is very much about doing it in the UK, but of course there are international options as well. So these are the places that you can do it in the UK. So you don't have like millions of options, or you don't have hundreds of options you might do if you're thinking of doing a PhD, say in history or history even. So there is kind of a limit on those options. And those schools will all be familiar to you because you probably did your MA at one of them, most likely. Okay, so now the juicy stuff. What does it actually mean to do a PhD in library and information science? What does that actually mean? Well, essentially, it's doing a PhD in information. It's studying information, and that might be a more conceptual study or theoretical study, or you might be examining information practices, or you might be doing a combination of both. For example, my PhD was very much theoretical, and it had a few ideas that could be put into practice, but it was very much focused on understanding, really doing a deep analysis of the theory to try and understand what was going wrong, but it doesn't really have many direct practical applications. But other people where I was studying had PhD studies which would be much more easy to implement, or very much more studying practice, and it can really, really vary. So what does it mean to study information? Well, it could mean looking at parts of the information cycle, like cataloging, acquiring things, collection development, storing things, preserving things, and disseminating information. You might be looking at the interactions between information and users. That's a very, very important area. And I think many, many PhDs in library and information science do that. So looking at how users look at information or encounter it, work their ways around it, something like that. Or you might be looking at the connections between information and technology. So you might be doing something in the digital world, but if you're doing a PhD in LIS, the chances are you'll be looking at more the information side and looking at the technology, but really from an information focus. But to be honest, there's PhDs which happen in library and information science, which might fit very well in computer science or media and communications. In a similar way, I think there's PhDs that get done in art history, which maybe could have got done in library and information science. So I personally think, I get in trouble for this one, that the disciplines can be quite fluid, particularly around the edges. But one thing is really important to realise is that obviously many of us have done our master's dissertations. I do think the PhDs can be a little bit wider than maybe what we did for our masters. So I think the boundaries of LIS as an academic discipline are probably a bit wider than what you did possibly what you did for your master's. You can think even more imaginatively about what you want to do. So what sort of things could that be for art librarianship? And here's just like the list off the top of my head, which I wrote down really quickly. Obviously, I'm going to say this, but art classification is such an important topic. We've heard this at the conference, and we're really crying out for deep theoretical studies in finding out exactly what is going on in those art classifications and looking at the connections between what's going on in the way that art history is taught and the libraries. There's been some work on this, but there hasn't been a full-length doctoral study as far as I'm aware or have ever seen. I think there's been a few dissertations and a few articles, but we can really do with some more stuff on that. That tempts anybody? Obviously, the diversity, the changing of collections is a really important area. And again, it's crying out for there's a lot of research, but there's crying out for lots of research taken from an LIS angle, I think. And visual information literacy, I mean, information literacy is such a big area, but specifically focusing on art students. Again, we've got some research on it, but again, there's definitely some doctoral studies in there. And looking specifically at visual information, retrieval of images, and studies of specific collections, which my colleagues on this panel, I think at least one person is possibly two people are doing PhDs from that angle, and of course the management of art collections, because as we know, art libraries are so interesting because they can fall between galleries and art and design training centres and art history. I mean, art libraries are just fascinating as organisations, and again, we could definitely have more research on that. So if you're thinking about it and thinking about doing a PhD, then I think there's so much opportunity and so many interesting topics which you could kind of have to yourself or have a lot to yourself. So I definitely think there's definitely a lot to say and a lot of research left to do in art librarianship. It's not one of these fields where you're having to carve out something interesting to say about Shakespeare. It's very wide open, I think, and there's some fascinating and really useful stuff out there. Okay, I'll get off that particular soapbox. So you've decided that you want to do your PhD, you're thinking about it. What sort of things do you need to consider? Well, choosing a department is very, very important. And LIS departments can be very different in the sense that they can often sit hierarchically and structurally in different faculties. They can sit in computer science or social sciences. You've got places like Sheffield and UCL, which are quite independent within information studies, have very big information studies departments that can kind of change what happens. But of course, the bigger decision is probably finding your supervisor. And this is where doing a PhD in LIS is a little bit different from doing one in history, I imagine, or English or music. Because you don't have that many people to choose from, you don't have that many departments, you don't have that many supervisors, you're unlikely, for example, to find two people in your department for your two supervisors who are both in your subdiscipline. For something like knowledge organization, which is my subdiscipline, there were two people in the whole country when I was looking to do a PhD. And actually, I ended up studying with someone who had done some knowledge organization, but was actually more involved with the philosophy and theory of information, and that really suited my approach. So you might want to think about a supervisor who kind of is in agreement with your general approach, and you're a very good fit in that way, but may not have very specific subject knowledge. So that's one thing to think about doing a PhD in LIS. It is so specialised that it may be outside of certain kind of more popular areas like information behaviour and information literacy, I'd say there you will find universities which have 2 or 3 people specialising them. You may end up getting this broader range of supervision, which is actually great because it means you'll be bigger, it means your teaching opportunities are wider. It's a good thing, but it is a bit different, I think, from doing something in a huge department where there's 20 Renaissance specialists. I know they're not. There's no department like that, but you know what I mean. You need to think about your mode of study. I'll get onto that in the next slide. And you also want to think about what the department can offer you in terms of things like teaching opportunities. I've put location on there, and I'll be interested to know what Leo says about this, because I think he did his PhD far away from where he lived, if I've got that correct, and I hope you don't mind me saying that. But it becomes far less important where you are to do a PhD than it would have done for something like a master's. So you can really think about broadening your range, because you just don't have to go in very often. Though that can be a problem for doing things like teaching and getting involved in the department. But you don't have to go in. So you can definitely extend your range in a way that you couldn't always do for your MA unless you were doing distance learning. So the question of part-time, I get asked this a lot. First of all, there's lots of different ways to do part-time study of a PhD. You can do the one where you basically work the whole time and do the PhD in your spare time. You can do a bit more like what I did, which was basically divide my life and do 1.5 days a week, 1 to 1.5 days a week on my PhD research, teaching and everything, and then have a job for the rest of the time. And so actually part-time covers a really wide range of approaches and, advantages and disadvantages. So there's not one way of doing it. And I think this panel is going to be great because I think we've all done it in a slightly different way. So that's going to be really interesting to talk about. So what are the advantages of doing a PhD part-time in LIS in particular? Well, first of all, if you're working in an academic or research library at least, or a specialist institution, there's a good chance that your bosses will know what a PhD is and generally be encouragement of it. They may not give you any time or money, certainly, I can say that one from experience, but they at least will understand what it is and they feel a bit guilty about, stopping you doing one. So there can be some advantages that at least you don't have to get over that hurdle of, explaining why you want to do it or what it is. Obviously, if you want to stay working in a library afterwards, it makes a lot of sense not to stop work and to continue working through it. And certainly that was my real motivation for doing it part-time. It's actually more complicated me doing my PhD part-time, but it meant I could stay working doing it. Obviously, you get paid, which is very, very useful. And it just leaves some options open. I would also say that I was quite glad for a lot of years that I was doing my PhD part-time because it was really, really intense. And it was really annoying at the end when I just wanted to get finished and had 3 months of work left to do. And it took me a year to do those 3 months because I was doing it part-time. But for the first 4 years, I really appreciated doing my PhD part-time rather than doing it every single day. So there are some advantages. There are some things to think about though, and without being too negative about doing a PhD part-time. The first thing I'm going to say, because I say this to everyone I talk to, sometimes people listen, sometimes they don't, and then I see them again in a year. And they never say, I wish I'd listened to you, that's too much to ask. But they do usually tell me their woes, which are exactly what I told them they would be. Anyway, this is that many of us did our MAs in librarianship part-time, and we all survived. We did it. We worked very intensely. We didn't see any friends for a year, but it was fine. We did it. Doing a PhD part-time is a bit different because it's just so much longer. It's so much bigger. There's so much more. There's so much which is less structured. And if you manage to do your MA part-time while working 36 hours a week in your library and not seeing anyone for a year, it probably won't work for your PhD. It'll work for the first year. And then you'll have to probably rethink, or you might be very ill or something, God forbid. So, it's just something to think about. It's a little bit of a different beast. One other disadvantage, it will take a lot longer to finish. I know that's really obvious, but it can feel a little bit endless, I have to say. I was okay for the first 4 years, but the last 2 years it did feel a bit endless. So that's one thing to think about. It's easier to imagine 3 or 4 years. It's certainly easier for life not to get in the way. But once you start talking 6 or 7 years, it's amazing what can happen. This is one which is quite personal to me, but sometimes in your department, particularly your wider department outside of LIS, the university may be set up, the faculty may be set up for PhDs to mostly be done full time. And if you come in as a part-time student, you might find the opportunities a bit more limited. I know this was my own personal experience, and I think other people haven't had that problem, or some have as well. So for me, it was things like meetings being put in the middle of the day with no notice on a day that I wasn't doing my PhD, teaching opportunities and things like that. And getting to conferences can be very difficult if you're mostly at work and you're having to get to those conferences in your leave from your day job. It's just things to think about, that it's not just about writing the PhD. some of the things, really important things that go with the PhD, getting involved in the department, taking a role in that department, organising seminars, going to training, going to extra things, and certainly teaching, which can be very important. Some of those things are much more difficult as a part-time student. There's a point in pink at the bottom, if you see, it's very important. Whatever you do, however you decide to do your PhD, if you do, you need some time off from work and study. And then I've had quite a few conversations with people who said, oh, I'm fine, I'm just going to work every day of my leave. And again, it usually works for a couple of years, but it's not very healthy. I'm just telling everybody that now. I'm the worst at doing this, so I'm telling myself as well. It's very important. And I've got about 1 minute left, so I'm going to just talk about myself. Best conversation topic. Okay, so I was an art librarian. I was at the for about 11 years. I worked at the Courtauld as a senior cataloguer for about 10 years, and then for 15 months I was joint acting head of the library. And while I was doing this, for almost the entire time I was there, I was doing my PhD, and then after that I was a visiting lecturer and everything. So most of the time I was at the Courtauld, I was balancing it with research and teaching. I have to say it worked a lot better when I was senior cataloguer than when I was joint acting head of the library. It was very difficult balancing being joint acting head. I did ridiculous hours some of the weeks when I was joint acting head and teaching and doing research. So I wouldn't recommend that. But that's my background in art librarianship, because my PhD was not actually in art librarianship, so I'm not quite sure. I'm kind of cheating my way onto this panel. So for my PhD, I did a deep analysis of the classification of music. I looked at how music was structured, how it worked on a classification level. And I looked in particular at how those in the music domain, so those musicologists, music historians, and music theorists, etc., and performers, how they perceived and wrote about the classification of music. And I analysed it from a knowledge organisation perspective. So it was conceptual, it was theoretical. I did a lot of content analysis of knowledge organisation systems. And in the process, I came up with some models of music classification, and also really looked again at our knowledge organisation systems and classification schemes and how they worked, and came up with some quite original ideas, not necessarily useful, but some original ideas about knowledge organisation systems. If you'd have asked me at the beginning if that was the way my PhD was going to work out, I would have not have known that at all. I had a vague idea I wanted to do something with music classification. But I think most people's PhDs go in their own direction, and you're just following along as they wander off. And that's what's really beautiful and great about doing a PhD. But I do some research on art as information, and I think there's some really interesting links between art and music. So I really hope to use my background in art, and then have done, and combining it with what I'm doing in music classification and knowledge organisation. And I've written some things, and I'm hoping to do more. I think there's some really interesting links there, which I think could do with some even more exploration. So I did my PhD while working. I started off doing my PhD working 4 days a week. After 2 years, it became clear to me that I wasn't going to move very fast. And so I worked 3.5 days a week, and I did my PhD research, other research. I was also writing other articles and teaching. And I was sort of stepping up the teaching that I was doing, and I did my teaching qualification and my PGCE and stuff at the same time as my PhD. Don't recommend that one. And I did all of that in kind of 2 days a week. So my regular week was like 5.5 days. If you're starting with the maths of that, then yes, so was I as well. So that's how I did my PhD. And there were good things and bad things about that. As to why I did my PhD, I was just really interested in classification, and I did some research on it, but I realized that I just couldn't do very much while fitting it into work. And I wanted to read more and do more and sit and read old books about classification and look at old classification schemes and to talk to people and discuss it. And for me, PhD made the most sense. I certainly didn't go into it with any career in mind, any idea of being an academic. I didn't not want to do that, but I didn't go into that. And what ended up happening is, as I did my PhD while keeping all my options open by working, so I really wanted to, keep everything open, it soon became clear to me that I loved my research. I was coming up with some interesting results, and I really, really loved teaching, and I was doing some good stuff with teaching. And so my final point, I promise, Carla, is that that's how I ended up doing what I was doing now. So I finished my PhD, became joint acting head, and then life went a bit chaotic, very hectic. And I did more teaching, picked up more teaching. And then now, for the last 9 months, I've been a full-time academic at UCL. I'm teaching knowledge organisation module, and I'm also teaching cataloguing classification. I'm carrying on with my research. I'm talking to people, I'm supervising dissertations, and I absolutely love it. But if you'd told me this is where I would have ended up, both literally and metaphorically, when I started my PhD, I wouldn't have predicted this. I wouldn't have ruled it out, but I wouldn't have predicted it. So I didn't go into this doing a PhD with this goal in mind, but I'm really, really happy with where I ended up.
Thank you so much, Debbie. Your enthusiasm is really infectious, and I would be very surprised if we didn't have a queue of people that want to do a PhD after your presentation. We will hear more about doing a LIST PhD with Leo later on. We are now going to look at doing PhD which are based on research in collections, and our next speaker is Dr. Karen Franco, the only panel member who does not come from a library and archive background. She is a curator and writer working within the context of archives and publishing, and is currently program curator at Chelsea Space and associate lecturer at MA Curating and Collections, both at Chelsea College of Art. Thank you, Karen.
Hello, thanks, Carla.
Hello.
Thanks, Deborah, and hello to everyone else on the panel and in the audience today. Yes, so my experience is quite different to probably most of the panelists here, in that I'm not a trained librarian, but my research intersects into the kind of frameworks and constructions of a lot of art libraries, because it's based in an investigation of artist publishing. So I came to do my PhD through answering a call for submissions that was produced by Dr. Ruth Blackthorne, who's based in the in the Department of Typography and Graphic Design at the University of Reading. She was working with Jennifer Mundy, who was the head of research at Tate, and between them they wrote a funding proposal for the collaborative doctoral partnership scheme that's run by the AHRC. So this is a scheme that works across organisations that have collections, so Tate, Science Museum, V&A, across the country, with universities to place PhD students within the organisation itself. So some of these projects are where you're working on someone else's research project, where there's a kind of formulation of the research area, and you input into that and develop your thesis in relation to it. This was slightly more broad in terms that the call was about, the title was basically Forms and Strategies and Contexts of Publishing in Modern and Contemporary Art Practice from the 1960s onwards. So the field was quite broad. My background, I guess, shaped quite distinctively my response to the call, and in that I've worked in various sort of places and environments as either a curator or a digital archivist. I've been involved in several digital migratory projects with organizations in terms of selecting, digitizing, and then organizing within CMS frameworks their materials. So the main project that I can reference, I suppose, in the context of this conversation is Bookworks Archive. Bookworks is an arts publisher, and I had a year placement with them to digitize material from their archive collection to connect to their publishing. So my interests have always been formulated between the relationships between archive and collection, and then the space of exhibition making. So this was the kind of framework that I took into my inquiry originally, which was shaped across the sort of 4 years that I worked at Tate to then produce my thesis. I chose to write the full thesis as opposed to doing a PhD by practice, because I was concerned, I think, at the time about the instrumentalization of my work as a curator. I think looking back, I would maybe rethink that in terms of the workload that I ended up having to deal with. But in some ways, you make these decisions and you follow through with them. And I kind of have no issue with having to write those extra 45,000 words, but at the time it felt quite difficult. And I think this is something obviously that Deborah's talked about. There are they're in different intensities in working full time on a PhD. One thing that the Collaborative Doctoral Partnership opens out is a series of peer groups within the organisation that you're researching in at Tate, but also a cohort that comes from the HRC partnerships. So I sort of worked around 3 different types of PhD cohorts, and that was a really interesting set of peer groups because the research was interdisciplinary. And so in some respects, the group at the university didn't necessarily connect with my particular research interests because it was a school of typography and graphic design. But my supervisor, Ruth Blackstall, was very much engaged in the kind of artistic inquiry into design practices. So we had a very strong connection in terms of our own research interests, and she was extremely supportive in the ways that I chose to work across the 4 years. And I have to say, in some respects, I feel like I had one of the best experiences that you can have doing a PhD through the network that is produced through the partnership itself. I would strongly encourage people to look into these types of schemes because obviously it provides you with funding, but it also provides you with a context in which your research sits. And I think sometimes, particularly when you're deep into something, you can find it difficult to locate who you're speaking to. And within this partnership, there's always someone kind of listening to what you're doing and encouraging you to sort of produce different types of outputs. So whether it's papers or presentations for different spaces and organizations. And again, that's something that comes with working on interdisciplinary research. It means that you can move between the environments of ARLIS, for example, into sort of art historical. So the Association of Art Historians Conference, for example, which was an organization that I joined as part of my PhD. And then other types of art related contexts and also book design context as well. So I think overall, oh, just one more thing I wanted to say actually before I hand over. Deborah brought it up as well. I think I went in initially with an idea of exploring a particular type of classification framework that I was interested in terms of how artist publishing is described within catalogues. And in the end, that became a kind of framing space for my research. I ended up actually writing about particular publications made by artists because they were items that I kind of found to be unarticulated in any kind of environment, whether it was through artist book histories, the histories of cataloguing or art history. So before I felt I could talk about the relationships between classification languages, I decided that these materials needed to be articulated more broadly. And so now I've finished my PhD, I'm looking more intently at those types of relationships, and I've been working with a fellow PhD colleague, Lizana Rosanova, on combining her technological research, which she made with Rhizome, around thinking about frameworks of description through linked open data models. And so in some respects now I feel that the work is maybe more acceptable in this kind of context of librarian and information science, but it was a journey that started in the same place to an extent, but you never quite know where your research is going. And that's something around fields that feel quite open. In particular, my field of sort of feminist writing and performance production from the 1960s was fairly open. It's not it's not an over-researched field at all, and so you feel that there's a very wide space for your work to fit and be related to other people's scholarship. So amongst the kind of intensities of attempting to write over a year to do my writing up year, which was very intense, it was also possibly the most enjoyable research period I've ever had. And it was an absolute privilege to work at Tate and to explore their collections and work with the specialists there, who were always incredibly helpful and made me feel included within the kind of dialogues within the institution itself. And my supervision equally so. It couldn't have been a better experience. So I'll end on that positive note and hand over to the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. And this is a great example of what you can do by working with collections. And although you're not a librarian, I think that your kind of PhD is something that would appeal to librarians and archivists, and probably look at it in a different kind of angle. And like both you and Debbie said, from when you start your PhD to wherever you end up at the end of your PhD is a journey, and is never what you thought. This is something that, having worked with PhD students for very many years, I've always found to happen. So well, thank you very much. And I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Gustavo Grandal Montero, who is in the final stage of his PhD. Gustavo is a librarian and special collections curator at Chelsea College of Art and Camberwell College of Art, University of the Arts, London. He is a trained historian. He writes and presents regularly at on librarianship topics, and has contributed to a range of academic and professional journals and monographs. He is a PhD candidate at the Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts, London, and he is the editor of the Arts Libraries journals. Thank you, Gustavo. Over to you.
Thank you, Carla. Hello, everyone. So yes, I'm an art librarian, and I've been working as an art librarian for more than 15 years, I think now. A lot of that time at University of the Arts, London. And I'm doing a part-time PhD, which I haven't finished. So I'm the only librarian on the panel. I'm also the only one that hasn't finished the PhD. It is quite a lot of work, indeed, particularly if you do it part-time. My topic is experimental literature and visual arts. Title at the moment is something like the Turn to Language, Concrete Poetry, and the Visual Arts in Britain in the long 1960s. And this is quite a long research project. I started formally 5 years ago doing this research, which is supported by my institution. I'm doing the PhD at the same institution that I work at University of the Arts, London. And my department pays the fees for the PhD and gives me an amount of study leave to work on this on a regular basis. So I'm very lucky in that respect. I'm very grateful for this, because I think that a lot of librarians do research, and I think that research is very central to the role of many of us, but it's not necessarily always recognized as such. Or value as such. I actually started doing research and professional writing quite early on in my career as a librarian. I was commissioned by the Art Libraries Journal by the wonderful Gillian Varley, who was the editor at that time, to write something about video art collections in art libraries, which is something that I had a little bit of experience and very little knowledge at that time, but the experience of writing that article was incredibly positive for me and very enjoyable. And after that, I did some more professional writing for the Art Libraries Journal, for the journals. And then I started also exploring more historical, perhaps, research or research that combine aspects related to my role as a curator for special collections, art history, and librarianship. I think that, again, going back to this idea of research being an important part of the role of many librarians, and how it's also central to curatorial work. The work that I've been doing in my PhD is based around collections at Chelsea College of Arts, but also is engaging with other public collections in the UK and in Europe, in other places. And because I'm lucky enough to be doing this is a theoretical PhD. So it's relatively art historical in nature. It's not practice-based, strictly speaking, as such, but because I work in an art design institution, I'm quite lucky in that there is a very receptive culture in terms of methodological approaches and in bringing practice-based elements into what is primarily a theoretical PhD. So I can bring aspects of my role as a special collections curator into my art historical research, which is very useful and quite exciting, both methodologically and on a day-to-day basis, really. In terms of the advantage, if you like, of doing a PhD, it does. I haven't finished mine, as I say, and I am not planning to become a full-time academic anytime soon myself. Although you know, who knows? But I definitely am very happy as an art librarian and as a curator of special collections, and that is my intention is to continue with that career. I just believe that perhaps it's not necessarily something that everyone will want to do, but for those of us in the profession that have an interest in research, I think is valuable in terms of personal professional development, but I think it's also valuable to the profession at large, to libraries, and to the universities as institutions to encourage and support library staff in getting involved with research, not just supporting research, but leading research and creating research capacity and research projects. And of course, the PhD is not necessary to be involved with research projects. There is a very recent report that has been published by Research Libraries UK on research by libraries or led by libraries that emphasizes that there's already an infrastructure that allows for librarians to work as part of multidisciplinary teams in research as PIs or co-PIs, and that is possible already. Perhaps it's something where institutional cultures, both in libraries and in wider universities, need to change. I certainly have found that being a PhD student, certain doors were more readily open, or it took less effort perhaps to get support to do things like organizing a symposium. So I did that, or perhaps being involved in curating external exhibitions, which I also was lucky to do. So it does create opportunities, and it's something that I think that is a very important reason why doing a PhD can be a very good idea. It's also, yes, a phenomenal amount of work. I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to finish my writing up. I'm hoping that in the next year or so, but I make no promises to my line managers or anyone else at this stage. I'll try as hard as I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. It's a lot to think about when you try to embark in doing a PhD, but it's very good to actually see what kind of PhDs one can do, and the fact that you're actually doing a PhD on the collection that you're working with. And maybe this is something that can appeal to other colleagues. We now go to our last panel member, Leo Appleton, as you know, our co-chair at the conference. He is the program leader for the MA in librarianship and deputy program leader for the distance MA in library and information science management at the University of Sheffield. In the School of Information, the Information School, and will share his thoughts about his experience of doing a LIS PhD. Over to you, Dio.
Thank you, Carl. Thanks very much, Carla, and thanks for organising this panel. And apologies to everyone for me being on this panel, because I'm sure you've seen and heard enough of me so far. But I'll in keeping with the rest of the panelists, I'll keep my little bit brief about my brief history, my brief PhD journey. What I would say from the outset is it's the best thing I've ever done, and one of the most positive experiences I've had in my kind of personal and professional life. But it's also the hardest thing I've ever done. So it kind of there's got to be a little bit of give and take. But in terms of the driver, and unfortunately you do have to, we'll have to give you a little bit of the backstory. I think I'd always wanted to do a PhD kind of in my adulthood, having just kind of embracing continuing professional development and always wanting to better myself. And just, I'd always been involved in workplace research. So it seemed a natural thing, but I didn't really have an end goal in mind. And also my wife has a PhD and my brother, so there's a little bit of internal competition in the family as well. So had to keep up somehow. But I was in 2013, I was working at Liverpool John Moores University. I had a year as the acting director of library and student support services, and then I became the associate director of library services. And during that period, I remember asking my boss, who was the academic registrar, if he would support me doing a PhD, and he said, no, absolutely not. You don't need it for your job. There's no need for you to be involved in research. To just keep running the library and doing what you do well. So that was a little bit off-putting, but I thought, well, I'm not going to take that. So I still kept looking out for a PhD opportunity, and I responded to a disc mail list posting for a stipend to do a PhD, something around value and impact, and it was in Edinburgh Napier University. And I phoned Hazel Hall. I don't know whether people know Hazel Hall, but she's quite renowned in the LIS scholarly world. And had a conversation with her. She said straight away, well, unless you move to Edinburgh, give up your job and study full time in Edinburgh, you won't be eligible for this stipend. So I'd missed quite a significant bit of the small print, but it was a significant conversation because we stayed on the phone, and she kind of talked me into. No, she didn't talk me into it there and then, but she planted some seeds saying, well, if you're really interested and you've got the kind of professional background, you're working in senior management, if you feel you want to do this, have a think about other routes. And then within about 4 weeks, I'd gone up to Edinburgh, had more conversation with Hazel, and I decided I would self-fund myself on a PhD. Now, I appreciate my positionality, both in terms of where I was in my career and kind of being able to afford, certainly at the outset, to start a PhD. That also contributes to the decision. And my initial thoughts were, I'd like to do a value and impact of academic libraries on higher education students. What I ended up doing was a thesis entitled The Role of the Public Library in England and Scotland in the 21st Century and its political, epistemic and community role within the information society. So quite different to what my intended PhD was, but that's part of the process. You've got to let it evolve. That kind of evolved in the early stages. And we'd arranged that I would go up to Edinburgh once a month. So bear in mind, I was living and working in Liverpool at this time, and have a supervision session, and I'd do it part-time. I'd always insisted I'm in no rush. I'm doing this as a kind of something I've always wanted to do, a labour of love. And that discussion to situate me in public libraries was intentional because Hazel had pointed out, if you do it in academic libraries, you're in your comfort zone, you may not be motivated, you may not be as driven. So let's do a similar thing, but in the public library sector. And I'm so pleased that we did, because it's just opened up this whole new kind of world of scholarship to me, and another field, another sector that I'm able to draw upon and kind of demonstrate some authority and expertise in now. So to cut a long story short, I took 7 years over my PhD, so 2013, and submitted my corrections. I think it was March last year, 2020. It was just before the COVID anyway. So I just managed to submit it. And I took 7 years over it, and because it was that we knew we had that period of time, we established quite a interesting methods for which I would conduct this research. So it's a completely empirical piece of research, and I used a longitudinal focus group study, which took some designing, but what I ultimately did was go around the whole of the UK, convening focus groups in public libraries, and did that for 3 years, fairly solidly over 3 years, so that I could kind of incrementally get focus group data from public library users to inform my thesis, and with the focus of it being on the role that the public library plays in the information society. So that also introduced me to information society studies, which is another subdiscipline of library and information science, but it isn't library and information studies. So there's kind of bringing together library and information studies and information society studies, and brought really a whole new kind of corpus of scholarship which I could draw upon. And then my second supervisor was Professor Anthony Duff, who is a renowned information society scholar, and that was fantastic, just a fantastic dynamic, having kind of two of the best scholars in their field as my supervisors. I also had a third supervisor, Professor Robert Ryside, who was there to offset all that social science stuff, because he was a statistician. So I had a great supervisory team. I think Debbie's point about choose your supervisor, I think the fact that me and Hazel met and had that conversation was me choosing the supervisor, and also I think Hazel in part choosing me. Make the most of the opportunity. So that longitudinal method was fantastic, and it's a real point of interest now. So methodologically, it's really interesting, and that because I've actually delivered papers just on the method, because it's so interesting in terms of qualitative research in library and information studies. I think some of you will probably know, again, my positionality really helped. So I did move, kind of continued my career, worked full time, moved to the University of the Arts London, and then moved to Goldsmiths. And at that point, I did always see my career still being in library leadership and management. That's a real passion of mine. But then I've got this public library strand. Could argue I've got a little arts library strand as well. So the kind of accruing knowledge, information, expertise, authority. And then this opportunity arose early last year at the University of Sheffield at the High School, and they were looking intensely for a library practitioner to come and join them as an academic and run the librarianship programme, but to bring all that experience in. Interestingly, it is an academic position, but a PhD wasn't the prerequisite for it, because they were looking for an academic, but I know that it really helped me to get that position. And I look back now and I realise actually teaching library and information management is what I've always wanted to do, although I'd never articulated that, but I do feel as though I'm in the job I've always wanted now. So the PhD has been a real lever for me there. It's been hard work, but I've really enjoyed getting into the research, and I hope I will have more opportunity to do research in the position that I'm in. And that's probably enough for a brief overview. Carla, leave a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much, Leo. We actually have already a couple of questions, and I had a number of kind of set questions, but I think most of them have been already answered by the panel. So I would say we go to the questions. The first one was put by Holly in the chat, and she asks, when is the right time to do a PhD? Somebody want to answer? Holly? Or Holly, if you wanted to expand on your questions, please drop in.
Yeah, it was just if you can be thinking about doing a PhD for ages, but I'd be interested to know your experiences of what actually makes you go for it.
I can chime in with my idea, but I think everyone will have different ones. It's a really interesting question. There are lots of people you speak to who, and I've met, who've been thinking about it for a while. I think when you start getting an idea of roughly what area you want to be in, but not necessarily a fully formed proposal, I think that's when it goes from being something I'd like to do in the future to something to do now. For me, what made me really go for it was, maybe this will be familiar to other people, but was when I first started talking to my potential supervisor. It was all very abstract until I had that conversation, and he was like, start now. I mean, I had to put a few things in place. So for me, there was the sort of potential supervisor being enthusiastic and going, you can actually do this, start. But I had to wait because there were certain practical things like getting an agreement to reduce my hours. So I think it's kind of as soon as you speak to a supervisor, they're going to encourage you, if it's going to work out, they're going to encourage you to start pretty soon. But then it's sort of tempered with whatever practical arrangements you need to put in place. But I'd be interested to hear what the other panelists think about it.
Yeah, I agree that practicalities are very important, and personal circumstances. I think I ask every year on my appraisal, my work appraisal, for support for PhD for 5 years until that happened. I don't think there is necessarily the right time. There probably are better times or worse times, but it's a very significant, particularly if you do it part-time, a very significant amount of work and commitment. And yes, as long as you know, you get the right sort of circumstances and the right support, I think that, to me, that probably the key aspect to consider.
Yeah, similarly, I think there are, I was just finding that I had a context for a set of research questions, and I developed a series of proposals to different institutions. Interdisciplinary research often finds that it has no home and it has several homes. And so you can never really put all your eggs in one basket unless, I think, you have a particular object or collection that you're very specifically writing research into. But at the time that I was developing my ideas for a PhD, I didn't have a specific collection in mind. But I was certainly keeping an eye on what calls were around, and people were sending me things that they thought were relevant, particularly because artist publishing is fairly niche. But yeah, there's never really a good time. I think it's maybe that it's a declaration to yourself that you feel that you have an area that you think is worthy of extending into a PhD. I think also, obviously, particularly in the UK, there's very few avenues outside of doctoral research that enable you to do the type of deep level interrogation of items or objects, you know, in any other circumstance. So in a way, you're kind of funneled towards these types of these projects. So yeah, I would just think, you know, look around and go for it, really.
And I would just concur. I think Debbie's point about when you have that initial conversation, it becomes real, because otherwise you're always going to be thinking about it. But it's once you start articulating what it is you might do, what you're interested in, that becomes real. And then you've got someone else potentially supporting you and telling you, you got to start this now. So you don't come back to it in a year, start it now. So it's a difficult one, Holly, but you kind of, when you know, you know.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you very much. We now have a question for Leo from the Q&A. Did you have to establish agreement for the focus groups with the libraries you worked with as part of your PhD application before starting, or did you arrange them after you'd started?
It was about 2 years in, whoever's asked that, because I had no idea what the method was that we were going to use. So that becomes part of your, it kind of naturally follows from the literature review, which you spend, like I spent about 18 months to 2 years doing. And then you're addressing the gaps in your field of study. And then you have to think about, well, how are you going to collect data for this? And it was only at that point we started talking about, well, even just choosing a focus group method, but then talking about multi-location and longitudinal, that all came a little bit later. So you don't need that detail at the outset.
Okay, thank you. So we have also another question in the Q&A from Laura Williams. And so she says, at the end of my year one part-time PhD, so the panel feels very timely. I find there is a weird contrast of two overlapping identities, accomplished librarian versus unconfident PGR student. Any thoughts on overcoming the imposter feeling, which might be intensified by being a part-time research student?
I just pick up on that, Carla, because I recognise that completely, of being kind of quite career driven. I felt I was doing well in my career, very confident, competent what I did in the day as the day job, and then feeling like a little school child again whenever I went to a supervision meeting. So there's and also being part-time and distance. I would my supervisors, that's no disrespect to my supervisors, they were brilliant, but it's their job to scrutinise and kind of put, you know, make you work. But also all my other kind of fellow PhD students at Napier were full-time, so they all had office space, and kind of had a base there on the campus, and I would just come in once a month as and kind of just say hello to them, and I'd say to Laura, in a way it kind of comes with the turf a bit, and it's just always be conscious of it, and always try and be as confident as you can in your own voice as a researcher, and that's advice that Hazel gave to me as well, but I think there might always be a little element of that somewhere. I'm sure Debbie and Karen and Gustavo might have different experiences, but it did resonate with me what Laura had said there.
I've got something to add to that. Two things really. The first is, obviously, you should not feel, Laura, you should not feel juniors, well, you should not feel that, there's something not unconfident, sorry, I can't think of it, in your research. It is something I think which grows with a PhD. And for me, I felt exactly like that, and maybe less confident in my day job, but I felt exactly like that. And for me, when I started going to conferences and having interesting conversations with people and getting stuff published, I think as you move on through the PhD and you realize people actually want to listen to what you say, or pretend to anyway, let's say for conference, you do feel more confident. So I think it will come. And I just wanted to kind of riff off something that Leo said. One of the things I found really difficult was going into a department as literally the most junior member of staff, because like PhD students are kind of hybrids between staff and students. And I was used to going in as a line manager, as a manager from work. So my first year, there was a lot of encounters with me going, okay, this is a problem, and how can we solve it? And my supervisors and other people in the department were not used to a PhD student with this, not attitude, but it took me a while to adjust to the fact that I was a student again. I really can resonate with Leo's idea of going back to being a school kid. I felt like that too. And I just realized I kind of needed to put on different personalities. But I think it's a balance, because those of us going in as experienced, competent, at least professionals into a PhD program, we do have a lot to offer. No offense to 23-year-olds, but compared to the 23-year-olds who've gone straight through or just had a couple of years not doing very responsible jobs. So in one sense, it is a bit of an adjustment. I certainly needed to adjust. But on the other hand, we should feel confident in our abilities, because those exact same abilities where we say teach a bunch of students or train our colleagues or manage something, they're actually really useful as PhDs and researchers. So I think it's a little bit of a balance, because yes, we are the most junior members as researchers, but actually we have a lot to offer. Maybe we shouldn't be adapting too much, and I'll get off my soapbox right now.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Does anybody else in the panel want to add anything to this? Okay, well, I think we have come to our time, and there is another question in the chat, but I wonder if the panel members want to answer the question in the chat, because we have the next session coming up. So thank you very much, everybody, for being on board. It was really a very interesting panel for me, because there are so many aspects that you brought into doing a PhD, and I hope it has been inspiring for the people here attending the conference today. So thank you very much, Debbie, Karen, Gustavo, and Leo.